Nearly 30 years after Tupac Shakur was killed, one of the biggest questions surrounding his murder is once again hanging over the music industry, and this time, it is not coming from a conspiracy documentary. It is being dragged back into the spotlight by the murder trial of Duane Keffe D. Davis. And suddenly, the name Sean Diddy Combs is back at the center of a mystery that many people thought would never be seriously examined again. And perhaps the biggest question is this: after nearly 3 decades, is there actually enough left to uncover the truth? According to the allegations now receiving renewed attention, Davis claimed during a 2008 interview with law enforcement that Combs offered $1 million to have Tupac Shakur and Death Row Records boss Suge Knight killed. Combs has repeatedly and strongly denied any involvement in Tupac's murder, calling the allegations false. Police have not identified Combs as a suspect in Tupac's killing. For years, the murder of Tupac Shakur has existed in a strange place between history and mythology. Everybody knows the basic story. Tupac was one of the biggest stars in the world. He was only 25 years old. He was riding through Las Vegas with Suge Knight after the Mike Tyson fight on September 7, 1996. Earlier that night, there had been an altercation involving Orlando Anderson. Later, a white Cadillac pulled alongside the BMW carrying Tupac and Suge Knight. Gunfire erupted, and Tupac died 6 days later. What happened afterward became one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American music. For decades, people argued over who pulled the trigger, who was in the car, who gave the order, and whether the murder was simply revenge or something much bigger connected to the East Coast-West Coast War. Now Davis is on trial, accused of orchestrating Tupac's killing. But the prosecution's case has created another problem because so much of the story appears to come from Davis himself. Over the years, he spoke about his alleged role in interviews, documentaries, a memoir, and conversations with investigators. Prosecutors say he was in the white Cadillac involved in the shooting and played a role in the events that led to Tupac's death. But now Davis says those stories were not true, while his defense argues that he spent years exaggerating and embellishing his connection to one of the most famous murders in music history. And honestly, this is where I think the entire case becomes fascinating. If a man spends years telling everyone that he knows exactly what happened, and then later says he made it all up, what are we supposed to believe? That is the central problem. You cannot simply believe Davis when his stories point towards somebody else while rejecting everything else he ever said. But at the same time, you also cannot automatically assume every word he ever spoke was true just because parts of his story are useful to prosecutors. The credibility of the man making the allegation matters. And that brings us back to Diddy. A former prosecutor and legal commentator quoted in the report explained that, theoretically, someone could face charges in connection with Tupac's death even if they were nowhere near Las Vegas and never touched a weapon, if they were proven to have hired, encouraged, commanded, or otherwise procured the crime. But the same legal analysis also points to the enormous difficulty of proving such a case decades later. The allegation against Combs has never been proven, and prosecutors would need independent evidence beyond Davis's statements to establish a case beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the part one thing people need to hear clearly. Could someone theoretically be charged? Yes. Does that mean a charge is coming? No. Does it mean there is enough evidence to convict anyone? Absolutely not, based on the information publicly described here. And yet, the allegations cannot simply be ignored either. Investigators apparently spent years looking into Davis's claims. According to testimony described in the report, investigators were trying to corroborate his allegation that Combs had allegedly given money to an intermediary for payment connected to Tupac's murder. They were attempting to follow the money and determine whether there was evidence to support Davis's story. That, to me, is the most interesting part of this entire story. Not the headline, not the speculation, the evidence. Because after 30 years, evidence is everything. Memories fade. Witnesses disappear. People die. Documents are lost. Relationships change. And the people who are still alive may have completely different reasons for telling, or not telling, the truth. The original East Coast-West Coast feud was also never as simple as fans sometimes make it seem today. This was not just two groups of artists releasing diss tracks and arguing on television. There were powerful record labels, major financial interests, personal grudges, street affiliations, bodyguards, entourages, and a growing atmosphere of hostility. Combs was the powerful head of Bad Boy Records in New York, while Suge Knight controlled Death Row Records in Los Angeles. Tupac's relationship with the conflict became deeply personal after he believed people connected to Bad Boy had been involved in the 1994 Quad Studios attack where he was shot. The conflict only grew worse afterward, although Combs and others denied involvement in that attack. This is why Tupac's murder has never felt like an ordinary cold case. Too many powerful names were connected to that era. Too many people had motives. Too many stories have changed over time. And now, almost 3 decades later, those same names are returning to a courtroom. The report says witnesses in Davis's trial are expected to include people connected to both sides of the old death row Bad Boy divide, including former associates of Combs. Suge Knight, who was sitting beside Tupac when the shooting happened, is also expected to testify. That alone tells you something important. This story is not finished. But we also have to be careful about what not finished actually means. It does not mean every rumor from the 1990s is suddenly true. It does not mean every famous person connected to Tupac's story is secretly guilty. And it definitely does not mean the public should decide the outcome before the evidence is tested. Sean Combs is currently serving a federal prison sentence in an unrelated case following his 2025 conviction on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution, according to the report. But his imprisonment in that separate case does not prove anything about Tupac's murder. Those are separate legal matters and should be treated that way. Combs continues to deny involvement in Tupac's death. In my opinion, that is another trap people need to avoid. When a famous person is already in trouble, the public sometimes becomes more willing to believe every accusation ever made against them. But justice does not work that way, or at least, it should not. A person's legal problems in one case cannot replace evidence in another. The Tupac case has to stand on its own. And right now, the biggest obstacle appears to be exactly what you would expect in a murder case that is nearly 30 years old: proof. A legal expert quoted in the report said prosecutors would need independent evidence corroborating Davis's admissions and independent evidence showing that Combs actually offered money for Tupac's murder. Without records, witnesses, or other proof of an agreement or payment, proving such a case beyond a reasonable doubt would be extraordinarily difficult. And that may ultimately be the answer to one of the biggest questions people are asking right now. Could the trial expose new information? Absolutely. Could it lead investigators to look again at old allegations? Possibly. Could somebody else eventually face charges? In theory, yes. But theory and proof are 2 completely different things. Nearly 30 years after Tupac Shakur was killed, the case is finally moving in a way that few people could have predicted. A man who spent years talking publicly about the murder is now facing trial. Old statements are being examined. Old rivalries are being revisited. And one of the most controversial allegations in hip-hop history has once again placed Sean Combs under public scrutiny. But the real story may not be whether another famous name gets pulled into the case. The real story is whether the evidence can finally separate fact from decades of mythology. Because Tupac Shakur deserves more than rumors. His family deserves more than endless speculation. And after almost 30 years, the world deserves an answer based not on documentaries, internet theories, or old street stories, but on evidence that can stand up to the truth. And perhaps that is what makes this trial so important. For the first time in decades, one of music's darkest mysteries is no longer just a cold case people talk about. It is back in a courtroom. And what happens next could change the Tupac story forever.